Today we're speaking with Shanelle Hall, founder of the Yellow House, a consulting firm with an emphasis on global public health, and she's also a former UNICEF Deputy Executive Director, as well as the Director of UNICEF's Supply Division based in Copenhagen. We have a couple of questions for her around the supply chain of what's needed to fight the COVID-19 right now and in the near and distant future. So we'll jump right in. Are there critical supplies that can help us manage COVID-19? And what does the supply chain look like? How will these different things get to market?
So indeed, there are a ton of supplies that can have a big impact on the disease, both in terms of prevention, but obviously diagnosing it and treating it. And I think a lot of what we hear about in the news is in fact sort of bottlenecks in supply chains, because for some of these critical supplies that are already available, we can see that there's insufficient supply to meet this bursting demand. So if we take the personal protective equipment, so the masks and gloves, obviously the masks need to be manufactured with a material and with a form that can prevent or act as a barrier of the COVID virus. And well, there's just a global shortage right now. And there are many different actors and governments who are putting in orders and trying to scale up manufacturing. But it's a big logjam, and manufacturers themselves have tough decisions on how to allocate the quantities that they have. A lot of the production, the big volume production, is in China. And so in many ways, the fact that the coronavirus started there has already got their production facilities ramped up at pretty big capacity with multiple shifts, which is great for the rest of the world. But still there's an unmet demand. And it's one of the things that you'll see organizations like WHO trying to really be a neutral party in influencing where the limited supplies are allocated, and working with governments and companies themselves. I mean, one of the snags that can be good and bad, depending upon where you sit, is that governments tend to opt to try to nationalize their supply, if not in full all, so that they have the influence over where it goes. And of course, everyone wants their people to be taken care of and wants to be able to give that assurance to their population, but that puts others at risk. So finding that balance of making sure these the quantities go to the right places is key and a critical role for WHO, and also just getting orders in so that production keeps going, so that manufacturers aren't having to take any decisions on should I put in my extra shift because maybe in 4 months from now we won't need these quantities. So there is kind of a no regrets decision making that needs to occur by governments and buyers, so that companies aren't taking those decisions on their own. Another one, well, obviously right now it's really this PPE equipment that really is the only prevention that we have, and right now the quantities need to be prioritized to the frontline workers. But obviously the gold standard for prevention would be a vaccine. Right now there are over 40 candidates, or I can't even say quite candidates yet, but 40 organizations, so universities, companies, etc., that are trying to develop a vaccine, which is an amazing number. I think for any disease in the past, I guess, 30, 40 years, we've never seen such interest by companies to try to find and develop a vaccine, or by researchers. So that's amazing. But realistically, to get a vaccine developed and then taken through the clinical phases that it needs to go through in order to make sure that it's A, effective, and B, safe, that takes time. And the regulatory authorities have expedited processes for this. So the EU does, the FDA does, the Australian TGA, obviously WHO does. So it really is shortened as much as possible, but you still need it to be safe. And so I think the projections that companies are saying that probably 12 to 14, 16 months before a vaccine gets through enough tests and evidence that it could be licensed for emergency use or for compassionate use is a reasonable and pretty aggressive timeline that we should be thinking through. And then once it's available, then we go through the scale up of production. And a vaccine is a biological, so it's more complicated to manufacture than, let's say, a pharmaceutical, which is really a chemical compound. So as soon as you have the discovery, you can rapidly manufacture and produce. So vaccines take longer. So they say, it can take up to 3 to 5 years to get the full capacity that would be needed. And obviously extraordinary measures would need to be taken. So if there's a candidate vaccine, is that contracted out so to other manufacturers, so that it's not just one company who's trying to meet the global demand for this. So there will be extraordinary measures that will be taken along the way. But a vaccine is not going to be our solution for this this first wave, if there are multiple waves of this pandemic. Medicines, so also hundreds of candidate medicines are being pursued, or therapies of one form or another. The ones that are kind of first off the docket are those that would be repurposed medicines, so medicines that have been licensed and approved for maybe one virus, and they want to put those so their safety profile is there. They just don't know if the effectiveness profile is there. So, for example, many people would have heard already about the chloroquine as an option, which is a anti-malarial. And there's a small study of around 30 patients that in China, where it looked like it had positive impact on helping patients get rid of COVID or fight COVID much more quickly. And combined with erythromycin, so combined with an antibiotic. But it's 30 patients isn't enough for a regulatory authority to say, yeah, this is enough evidence to recommend wide-scale use of this. But there are, I think, 4 or 5 trials going on right now to see if, in fact, it could be recommended for use. So maybe we're months away from that. And that, is an inexpensive product that has large production volumes. There would, of course, be shortages, so because the demand overnight would just be enormous. But it's still going to be much easier to scale up that product because it's a chemical compound, so a pharmaceutical as opposed to a vaccine. And there's also the Gilead product that also was developed to fight the SARS and MERS virus, and so that one is also a potential. So there's a few. We'll probably see a pharmaceutical or a couple of pharmaceuticals earlier than we would see a vaccine. And then maybe the third product group that we would have our eye on is diagnostics. Testing is fundamental. It's the first pillar of the strategy for how to fight COVID, and that's to test people who present symptoms, find their contacts, test their contacts. But because of limited testing, contacts are only tested if they present symptoms. And moreover, the test just right now tests if you have the virus in you. So it's a moment in time. And so first we need a scale up of those tests. For those in the HIV world, it's a PCR test. So it's widely used all over the world, but we just really need the commercial scale up of those tests. But there's also research underway to try to get an antibody test. So an antibody test would be able to tell if a person did have COVID. So, and if then they're immune, which has huge impact because, well, for many reasons it's good because you understand the disease. But like when Ebola, so survivors of Ebola really wanted to contribute to stopping the outbreak, and knowing if you are protected against a disease gives you a different level of confidence in your society being of help. So if people knew that they were immune to COVID and then could maybe safely support the elderly or work in grocery stores or do what they could to help, I think. So there's many reasons why knowing and an antibody test would be great. And the last one, which is, let's see, but a test that could be taken at the point of care. So right now, the testing needs to go to a lab facility in order to diagnose if you have COVID. But huge gains were made in HIV and malaria in particular to move the testing closer to the point of where the patient gets tested, and knowing in a matter of minutes whether there was a positive. And if there was a positive and if the sensitivity was low, then they could be referred to a lab, but it also quickly ruled out if you didn't have it. So, I mean, we know that there would be companies that do manufacture point of care diagnostics that would also be pretty amazing to know, much more quickly whether someone at least doesn't have COVID on an assured way. So a ton of different products, and all of it, there's going to be market issues. And you want multiple manufacturing base, you want products to be allocated to those in need the most. And these are tough decisions because it's global, it's political, and I mean, these are, because of the economic factors, it's not easy to address the supply and demand issues. But I think that's why kind of the multilateral system is there to really help the world navigate these situations the best as possible. I mean, the virus isn't really known yet, right? It's novel, so everyone's learning about it. No one knows, will this outbreak continue? Will it become seasonal? Will it become endemic? Or will it just fizzle out? I mean, I think it's a no regrets basis. So you have to plan on that that it's here to stay. And so a vaccine becomes of the utmost importance for the medium term. But a vaccine isn't going to be available to help us out of this year. But the urgency of action is as critical as if we think it was going to help us this year, because the timelines are so long. And companies will be putting a lot of research money into this, and they will need assurance that if the disease starts to wane, that the world doesn't walk away from them, because they may be then slow to attempt again if there's another virus that has big impact. I think we saw it something like this with Ebola, although that's kind of turned around. And there's an organization called CEPI, which is really helping make sure that we don't have these lost gaps. And obviously Gavi helps scale up these vaccines for low-income countries. But so, I mean, all that to say, it's critical that the effort in vaccine is jump-started now, but it's not going to be the solution for the short term being 12 months plus, right? And that's where, in terms of helping patients who get COVID fight it, that's where the therapies will be most important.
Shanelle, you're doing amazing work cutting through the noise and sharing insightful and helpful information. Let's walk through how you're consuming information and sharing it on social media so that we can help our communications professionals who are watching and help influence exactly how they're consuming and then also reposting.
Thanks. I don't know if I'm getting it right, but I think I decided early on that the information, I'd rather get information more from the source. And this is ultimately a really technical, novel thing. So I started really using the Twitter feeds of a few researchers and medical journalists that I thought were able to digest and process the information. I am not a virologist or an immunologist or a medical doctor, so I understand why it can be so confusing. So for me, I really latched on to people whose voice kind of helped me understand which things were important and who were over time trusted, including like who followed them ultimately, right? So who has a reputation. And then of course, as the virus changes, so I would, or it starts to move, I would find people who are speaking from a geographical area in order to better understand what was happening there. So like in Italy, or obviously now in the US, Seattle is my hometown, so I have been following the public health authorities there and a couple of like their chief medical officer there locally, which more just to help me keep current. So I tend to do that. Also, I think I prefer reading information more so than watching it on the television, because I feel like tone of voice kind of gets my anxiety up as well. So I obviously watch it, particularly when there's, like in Denmark here, when the Prime Minister speaks, and when there's official messages, and I tune in a little bit, but most of it I get through online, so kind of on demand, even if it's podcasts I listen to or videos I watch, so that I'm sifting through it. But there's just amazing number of smart people who are spending their time to give information. And so I just feel like it's unlike, probably certainly different than the last time we had a 100-year event, so the 1918 flu. But I think it's really unlike any other global issue that we've had. Like we haven't been so connected. So there's a lot of information to read through, but finding those voices that have credibility and have, I mean, they don't need to be necessarily academics, but they do have legitimacy, and they themselves are not being swayed by the important and sensitive politics of issues or like the moods, but just steady, focused on certain areas, whether it's research on the virology of it or understanding, like modeling the impact of social distancing measures. I mean, it's amazing stuff that's out there that's in many ways reassuring that there's all these brilliant minds on the planet that are diving into this. So that's how I look at it.
Shanelle, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And we'll check back in with you as the story further develops and the different products make their way through the different hurdles of actually getting to people who need them.
Great, thank you.